Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources here today.
We certainly do.
And our mission, like always, is to, dig in and pull out the most important insights just for you.
Mm.
Today, we are tackling a real classic, a book published right in the middle of World War II that issued this powerful warning about where society might be heading.
That's right. We're diving into excerpts from F.A. Hayek's, hugely influential work, The Road to Serfdom.
Right.
Our source material is the Routledge Classics edition. So that includes the preface and various chapters that really lay out his core arguments. It's a book, acknowledged by big names like Milton Friedman and referenced by observers Hayek himself quotes.
And our goal here is to really unpack Hayek's central concerns, these worries about economic planning, about collectivism, but drawing only from these sources you've put in front of us.
Exactly.
And Hayek's preface itself is quite revealing, isn't it, about why he wrote it. He felt this sense of duty.
Yes, he did. He explains that many economists who kind of shared his worries were busy with the war effort or maybe silenced by official positions.
Right.
So that left public opinion, as he controversially puts it, to be shaped by, amateurs and cranks.
Wow. And he's quite pointed about his personal stake, or lack thereof, says his views run counter to his own advantage, even his earlier beliefs.
He is very clear on that. He felt he had to speak out because others couldn't publicly voice these apprehensions about the direction society was taking.
Okay, let's dig right into that core warning then. What is the absolute central idea Hayek is trying to get across here?
Well, his main thesis, laid out pretty early on, is that the path Western societies, he's specifically thinking about Britain and the U.S., at the time the path they were increasingly taking wasn't leading to more freedom.
No.
No, it was leading towards what he starkly calls the high road to servitude.
Servitude, okay. And he contrasts this with what he calls the abandoned road. What was that road?
He paints this broad historical picture, a gradual shift away from these rigid hierarchical systems towards individual freedom, towards commerce, and what he calls spontaneous order. He traces it from, the commercial cities in northern Italy, then spreading through the Low Countries, Britain, and eventually to the New World.
And he links this directly to progress, doesn't he? He says something like, only when industrial freedom let individuals use new knowledge freely, try things out at their own risk.
That's exactly it.
Right.
That's when science and innovation really took off and, changed everything. That era, for Hayek, was all about freeing the individual from just doing things the prescribed way.
Allowing for this kind of unpredictable but ultimately good social evolution.
Precisely.
So that's the path of individual liberty, spontaneous order that he sees being left behind. What did he think was replacing it?
Okay, this is where he brings in the great utopia. He argues that socialism, despite all its promises of more freedom, more equality.
Yeah, the lofty goals.
In practice, it was actually leading societies down a path that resulted in the complete opposite.
And he uses some, pretty striking quotes from his sources to back this up. People observing Russia, Germany, Italy back then, what were they concluding?
Yeah, he quotes figures who weren't necessarily hostile to these movements initially, like Max Eastman, who was a friend of Lenin's.
Oh, really?
Yes. And Eastman concluded, according to Hayek, that Stalinism is socialism, and that it was an inevitable, though maybe unforeseen, political result of nationalization and collectivization. Others like W.H. Chamberlain, F.A. Voigt, they drew similar lines connecting Marxism, fascism, and National Socialism.
There's that Voigt quote saying, Marxism has led to fascism and National Socialism because, in all essentials, it is fascism and National Socialism. That's a very strong claim.
It really is, and it reflects a key argument Hayek found in these sources, that maybe the stated goals differed, but the methods these collectivist systems used had really disturbing similarities and consequences.
Walter Lippmann, too, right? Observing that turning from freedom to coercive organization means giving up the richer life you hoped for.
Yes, because centralized direction just increases uniformity, reduces variety. It simplifies things in a way that impoverishes life.
And that Edward Hyman, quote, the German religious socialist, noting Hitlerism claimed to be true democracy and socialism.
And that there was a grain of truth in those claims, which is startling. But the crucial distinction Hyman makes, which Hayek picks up on, is that Hitler never claimed to represent true liberalism. Hyman's view, as Hayek presents it, was that liberalism was the doctrine Hitler hated most, And by the time Hitler came along, liberalism in Germany was basically dead.
Killed by socialism, according to Hyman via Hayek.
That's the argument presented,
Yeah.
that these totalitarian systems grew out of collectivist thinking, not as a reaction against it, and definitely not against liberalism.
Wow. That certainly forces you to look at things from a challenging perspective. Okay, so let's get clearer on collectivism as Hayek uses the term. He makes a key distinction, doesn't he?
Yes, absolutely fundamental. He separates collectivism as the method. The central planning, replacing the market, the individual entrepreneur, with some central body directing everything.
Okay, the how.
Right. He separates that from socialism as a specific goal or end, which is usually focused on things like equitable distribution.
So for Hayek, the real argument isn't just about, say, what socialists want, but how any kind of collectivism plans to get there.
Precisely. He's arguing that the methods themselves, the ones common to all forms of collectivism, they have inherent consequences. And he believes those consequences are just incompatible with a free society, regardless of the specific aims.
But he's not arguing for, like, pure laissez-faire, is he? No state role at all. He talks about competition differently.
No, not at all. That's a common misunderstanding. Hayek defines competition not as just the state doing nothing, but as a method, a way to coordinate what individuals do without needing some coercive authority telling everyone what their job is.
Yeah.
But, and this is key, this system only works if you have the right legal framework supporting it.
What kind of framework does he mean?
Well, clear rules. Rules defining property rights, ensuring freedom of contract, making sure markets can function, sound money, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
And he definitely acknowledges the state has to act where competition just can't work effectively, like providing public goods roads, signposts, as he mentions, or dealing with things like pollution, where the costs aren't directly borne by the person causing them.
So the state acts, but how?
The crucial thing for Hayek is that state action must follow general, predictable rules, not specific interventions aimed at helping this group or hindering that one. General rules, not specific directions.
Okay, and this leads to a core warning from Hayek, trying to mix central planning against competition.
Yes, this is critical. He sees planning and competition as fundamentally different ways to solve the same basic economic problem. How do you coordinate everything?
Alternatives.
Right. And he argues that trying to mix them, specifically planning against competition rather than planning for it by setting up those general rules, well, it just makes both systems ineffective. You get worse results than if you consistently relied on one or the other.
And he sees this kind of mixing leading somewhere specific, down a slope.
He does. He views things like the corporative or syndicalist setup where maybe you suppress competition but leave planning to separate industry monopolies. He sees that as almost an inevitable first step away from competition.
Why?
Because these groups, these monopolies, they might agree on wanting to kill competition, but they disagree on everything else. This creates tensions and pressures that ultimately push towards more and more complete state control to impose a single plan.
He also takes on this idea that monopoly and planning are just inevitable, driven by technology, bigger is always better, that sort of thing. What's his take?
He pretty much dismisses that as a myth, often pushed, he thinks, by those who want planning anyway. He actually points to an American study, the Temporary National Economic Committee. A source, he notes, cannot be accused of an undue liberal bias. And their final report apparently found that the idea that bigger firms always win because they're more efficient, well, it finds scant support in any evidence that is now at hand.
So it wasn't technology making monopolies unavoidable.
Not according to that study, as Hayek presents it. The tendency towards monopoly was seen as being promoted by public policies. Hayek argues it's mostly fostered by deliberate government choices, collusive agreements, often protected or even encouraged by the state.
And he uses Germany as a key example.
Very much so. He traces it back to 1878, arguing that the growth of cartels and syndicates there was systematically pushed by deliberate state policy. He sees Germany as the prime example where suppressing competition wasn't an accident, but a conscious policy choice made in the name of what they eventually called planning.
So the nugget here is Hayek saying this whole shift towards planning isn't some unavoidable tech trend, it's a result of ideas and policy choices.
Exactly. And he flips the complexity argument on its head. He says the very complexity of modern life, the huge division of labor, actually makes decentralized coordination through competition more necessary, not less.
How so?
Because no single person, no board, can possibly know everything needed to plan effectively. You need decentralization precisely because it's so complex. And that famous quote of his comes in here in Social Evolution. Nothing is inevitable, but thinking makes it so. Meaning the ideas we buy into shape our future.
Right. Which brings us to a really major point. The danger planning poses to, well, governance itself, to the rule of law. Why does Hayek argue planning and democracy just don't mix?
His argument is that planning requires agreement on a huge number of very specific ends. Detailed outcomes for everyone, different people, different industries, different regions. Democratic assemblies, though, they're designed for deciding on maybe limited alternatives or broad general rules. They're just not built, he says, to reach the kind of detailed agreement needed for a comprehensive economic plan.
And this inability to agree, it creates problems,
Right.
pressure.
Huge pressure. It leads to frustration. Democracy's too slow, too much talk. And then come the demands to delegate power. Give it to the experts. Give it to a strong leader, someone who can just make the decisions and get the plan moving.
But if you delegate to experts, isn't that just a technical matter?
Hayek argues it's presented that way as technical, but it's fundamentally political. Because delegation means choosing between conflicting goals. Whose needs come first? Which groups get the benefits? Which bear the costs? That's not technical. It's a value judgment.
And majorities can't easily agree on that level of detail.
Exactly. So this pressure for a single plan, a unitary conception, can easily lead to calls for a strong leader who acts on their own authority, potentially leading to what he terms a plebiscitarian dictatorship. Meaning a leader may be confirmed by popular vote, but who holds essentially absolute power because they have to be able to execute the plan without being constantly challenged or delayed.
So the core insight is pretty stark then. Hayek is saying democracy can really only work properly within a competitive system, one based on private property, if collectivism takes over.
He argues democracy destroys itself. It just can't manage the planning process effectively or democratically.
And it's not just democracy that suffers. He says planning also destroys the rule of law. How does he define the rule of law first?
Okay, key definition here. For Hayek, the rule of law means the government is bound by fixed rules announced beforehand, rules that allow you to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its powers. It means laws are general, predictable, their specific impact on particular people isn't known in advance. It's about formal equality, impartiality.
And planning requires the opposite.
Pretty much. Planning requires deliberate discrimination. To make a plan work, the state has to decide how well off specific people or groups are going to be, what resources they get, what they can or can't do. This, he says, is a return to the rule of status, where your legal position, your rights, your duties depend on your assigned role in the plan. It reverses that historical shift towards formal equality before the law, towards freedom of contract.
So formal equality, treating everyone the same under general rules, just can't coexist with deliberately aiming for material equality, trying to make sure everyone ends up with similar outcomes.
That's his point. To get the same result for different people, you inevitably have to treat them differently. He uses the example of calling private property a privilege. He says it's only a privilege if it's arbitrarily reserved for some, like land for nobles or specific trade licenses. But calling it a privilege when anyone can acquire it under the same general rules, that's a confusion, he thinks, stemming from this clash between formal legal equality and the goal of planned material equality.
And the rule of law limits the type of laws you can pass. They have to be general, formal.
Yes, excluding laws aimed at specific individuals or granting arbitrary power to officials. And this applies even if that power was gained through technically legal means. He uses Hitler gaining dictatorial power constitutionally as an example. The process might have been legal, but the result, arbitrary power, violated the rule of law itself.
Okay, this moves us into maybe the most disturbing part of the book, the impact of all this on individuals, on the moral fabric of society. Hayek argues controlling the economic means ends up controlling our ends, our goals in life.
Yes. His point is that in a market system, if you suffer an economic loss, it usually affects the margin of your needs. You might have to give up something less important to keep something more important, but you still have choice.
Right.
But if the state controls the economic means, your job, your resources, it essentially dictates which needs can be satisfied, even our higher non-economic values. Control over the means becomes control over the ends we can pursue.
And things like individual choice, security, they become really difficult under planning.
Extremely. Without market signals like prices and wages telling you what society values, how do you choose a career? How do you know how best to contribute? The planner's judgment, the plan itself, becomes the only yardstick. And trying to plan for security, say, guaranteeing incomes or jobs for one group, That often means restricting opportunities for others outside that protected group. It can actually increase insecurity and unemployment elsewhere and create a society stratified by one's place in the plan. This constant seeking of security over independence, Hayek warns, leads towards a more regimented, almost military-like society.
And then comes that really chilling question he asks. Why the worst get on top in totalitarian systems? What's the argument there?
Well, this section explores the kind of moral consequences that flow from demanding total loyalty to a collective goal. It forces individuals, he argues, to set aside traditional morals, truthfulness, compassion, respect for individual life, because the collective end justifies the means. Things we'd normally find abhorrent become necessary tools if they serve the plan.
But why does that specifically elevate the worst people?
Because, linking back to his earlier point about democracy failing for planning, achieving the collective goal requires a certain single-mindedness. Often, a ruthlessness that clashes with traditional morals.
Oh, okay.
So those individuals who are willing to do the bad things, to be cruel, deceptive, to spy, they become useful, even necessary instruments for the system, and that gives them a path to power. The jobs at the top in such a system may be heading propaganda or the secret police like the Gestapo he mentions. They require those traits. Success tends to go to the unscrupulous. Lacking strong personal morals can actually be an asset if you're just executing the leader's will.
And this control extends even to information, to ideas, the end of truth, he calls it.
Absolutely. In a totalitarian system, the control has to be total. Facts, ideas, history, everything must support the single overriding purpose set by the authority. Truth isn't something discovered anymore. It's whatever the leaders say is necessary to achieve the plan. And it can change tomorrow if the plan changes.
He mentions bizarre things like party in mathematics or German physics.
Yes, exactly. Examples showing how even science gets twisted to serve the ideology. The test for a new theory isn't, is it true, but does it serve National Socialism? Truth becomes just another tool of power.
And he pushes back against the justification that, well, opinions are shaped by outside forces anyways, so maybe it's better if the state just guides them deliberately.
He sees that as a profound mistake, a form of intellectual hubris. His argument is that reason, progress, new ideas, they grow out of the messy, unpredictable interaction of different individual minds, freely exchanging ideas.
Right.
Trying to plan or organize that process actually stifles it, leads to stagnation. Individualism, for Hayek, involves a certain humility, recognizing that this complex social process of discovery is beyond any single mind's control.
Let's trace some of these ideas back a bit, as Hayek does, particularly that controversial argument about the socialist roots of Nazism.
Right. He really insists Nazism wasn't just some capitalist reaction against socialism. He argues it drew significant support from socialist circles, specifically those who'd sort of given up on the abstract ideal of freedom and instead embraced ideas about organization, power politics.
He names names.
Yes, he points to German thinkers Plenge, Ostwald, Rohedenau, Neumann, Lensch, who were advocating for state-led organization. They saw World War I, incredibly, as a struggle between English individualism and German organization, or socialism. Paul Lensch, a socialist politician, even called the war the flight of the English bourgeoisie before the advance of socialism.
Wow.
They saw Germany's industrial concentration, its cartels, which were fostered by state policy, mind you, as a higher, more advanced form of society.
And Hayek worried he saw similar trends, these totalitarians in our midst, cropping up in places like Britain.
He did. He was very concerned about the adoption of anti-competition ideas, even within parts of the labor movement there. He saw it as a potentially fatal turn, moving towards granting privileges to specific groups at the community's expense, a path he felt mirrored Germany's earlier trajectory. He even notes a sort of disturbing similarity in the mood, the readiness to break with tradition in some British writing of the time, compared to the German works that preceded Nazism.
Okay, finally, let's look at the international picture. Hayek argues abandoning liberalism in international relations was costly, and that international planning is even more impossible than national planning.
Yes, he thinks international planning would require even more brute force. Why? Because disagreement about goals and priorities is vastly greater between nations than within one nation.
Makes sense.
Nations might agree on general, formal rules in a free system, but they'd likely never agree to let some international body dictate their economic priorities or their pace of development by majority vote. Trying to create a comprehensive international plan is just seen as incredibly difficult, maybe even irresponsible, compared to simply enforcing basic rules to stop nations harming each other.
So what's his alternative for international order then? based on his principles.
Federation, but a specific kind. It involves transferring limited, clearly defined, and mostly negative powers to an international authority.
Negative powers.
Powers to restrain nations, stop them from harming their neighbors, enforce common rules of conduct, rather than powers to actively direct their internal affairs or economies. It's applying that principle of limited government internationally. He sees this as the only way to make international law truly stick.
And he's a bit skeptical about huge global organizations.
He is. He suggests smaller, maybe regional federations might be more practical to start with, because you're more likely to find genuine agreement and shared values on a smaller scale. But crucially, he stresses that for any international order to work, powerful countries like Britain must be willing to submit to the same rules and restrictions they expect others to follow. No special treatment.
So we've really journeyed through the core arguments of Hayek's Road to Serfdom. We've traced his concerns all the way from that historical shift away from individualism to the dangers he saw in planning for democracy, for the rule of law, for individual freedom, even for truth itself, and the moral character of society.
And that core warning really echoes throughout.
Yeah.
That the path of comprehensive planning, no matter how well-intentioned it might seem at the start, well, it concentrates power. It erodes the very foundations of a free society, that spontaneous order, that individual liberty, and ultimately, he argues, it leads towards a state of servitude.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a specific lens, Hayek's lens, to look at today's debates. Debates about government's role, about planning versus liberty. How might these warnings from history about centralized control, about the methods of collectivism, show up in maybe subtle ways now?
And perhaps a final thought to leave you with, drawing from these sources. If Hayek argues that democracy fundamentally needs a competitive system based on private property to even survive, what might that imply for our own political systems today, especially if ideas that prioritize planned outcomes over spontaneous processes, specific directions over general rules, continue to gain ground? It's a challenging question about the deep connection between how we organize our economy and the possibility of political freedom.